started recording. Sorry, I hadn't done.
Thank you, Jane. We're starting to dig into the substance of the work of the Mitigation Subcommittee. So I have to just say on a personal level, I'm excited that we're doing that. We're spending time starting with this meeting, digging more deeply into the policies and programs and measures that the committee will be considering. And so I'm excited to get into that work. We also have made a lot of progress in terms of bringing consultants on board and welcoming them to this process. I'm really happy about that. And we're making progress on procedural issues and integrating just transition principles. So I feel like we're moving, and really happy to welcome you all to this meeting so that we can keep going. Does anybody have comments about today's agenda? It's been posted. Do we want to make any changes or additions?
Wouldn't necessarily make a change, but just to flag for everybody the meeting on June 17th, where the Just Transition Subcommittee will be walking through with the public their proposed guiding principles for just transition. I think that will be a great event, and hope folks from our subcommittee can make the time to be there. That is from 4 to 6 p.m. on the 17th. And the link to your guiding principle, the proposed guiding principles, are in our agenda.
In the agenda, right. And for those who are interested in seeing how this compares with or is in line with other approaches to just transitions, I'm going to be participating in a seminar that same day, a webinar put on by Resources for the Future at noon that day. So for anyone else who's interested in exploring that one, you could find that online. Same day. We've reviewed minutes in the past and just accepted them by consensus. The minutes have been circulated. Are there any comments, additions, objections to the minutes of the last meeting? I can say I looked them over. I think they're fine. Peter and Jane, I think, have all had a hand in them. All right, without objection, we will approve those minutes. Now we have a happily, I say, Public Service Department is launching a series of engagements as part of their work on the Comprehensive Energy Plan. And we discussed last time the importance of coordinating our listening sessions and outreach sessions with the work of the department on the plan. And maybe Jane and Peter, you've been having some conversations about how we can do that. Would you take us through that?
I can start, and I'm glad that both TJ and Ed are with us today to sort of pick up on what I'll start right now, which is that myself, I think it was just me with respect to the Climate Council work, met with the Public Service Department staff around their timeline for engagement and got up to date on where they are. And the next step for them is really around stakeholder engagement that they had planned to do during the month of July. Recognizing the need to coordinate with all of you because we'll be hitting the same stakeholders with respect to the sectoral work that you're all engaged in. It made sense for us to step back and think about what the goals were for the Public Service Department for this component of their engagement and how it could or couldn't align with the goals of engagement that you all want to do to test out your strategies. So I'll just remind you that Climate Access and RISE are on contract for us and are really thinking and I'm learning this and being reinforced as we work with them further and further around public engagement at a broader level. And then we also have a contract with CBI to think about our facilitation, and there was space within their contract to help us with public engagement. We're now starting to see a gap in what Climate Access and RISE is planning to do, and recognize a discrete role for CBI staff, especially through Catherine's support of your work, to help us specifically with stakeholder engagement. And so thinking about how and if it made sense to combine the public engagement specifically for stakeholders with the Public Service Department, we had a conversation and thought about the timing of that, recognizing that our public engagement plan won't be done till the middle of July, and don't, as a result, want to sort of go full bore into stakeholder engagement until we have that plan back. And recognizing that the Public Service Department had the month of July put aside for their stakeholder engagement, we started to shift and think about the possibility of coordinating that engagement starting at like mid to end of July into early August, and aligning sort of the goals that are bigger picture engagement that the Public Service Department would have normally traditionally done through these stakeholder meetings, with also testing some of the big bucket ideas and strategies that are coming out of all of your task group conversations. So we think this is a really nice fit. We have a meeting on Monday to sort of start to think about what an agenda would look like for those meetings, and then want to put them on the calendar, recognizing that there'd be a significant role for all of the task group leads here to play at the transportation meeting, at the buildings and thermal meeting, stakeholder meetings, and then start to have some smaller individual meetings with all of you about who the right people are to invite to those meetings sooner rather than later, recognizing that the summer is going to be a hard time to get really thoughtful engagement from people. So why don't I pause there and ask TJ and Ed to sort of step in and think about how the Public Service Department is thinking about this and this alignment. But I'll just say, I think it comes at a really nice time in the process for us to work together and not hit these people multiple times with very similar messages. So thanks, Ed and TJ.
Great, thanks, Jane. I do want to first note that this is not the only engagement process for the CEP. This is something that we have historically done topic-specific or sector-specific meetings, actually more topic-specific meetings in the past. Just gather a bunch of folks, have a more concerted discussion. Here, what we were thinking, we're planning on doing that. We're trying to figure out what the topics were going to be. And then we had this sort of realization, looped Jane in, and do want to focus on sector specific and mirror the same, transportation, heating, and electricity that we're talking about for cross sector here. And figure out some way of having what the folks are working on within this sector, but also recognizing that what we're doing in the near term is much more targeted towards 2025. Also have a broader discussion too about more structural behavioral changes, other things that are necessary to actually get us to 2050. And so I guess I would just say that we do need to separate out sort of near-term goals, which we do have some concerns about how these are going to be presented. We don't want to, how do you have these meetings in such a way of here's a bunch of ideas, they're fully baked, what do you think, versus having ideas that are, here's some short-term ideas that we have that we're hoping are no regrets in the near term, and how should we all think about this in the longer term as well. So I think these topic-specific meetings, sector-specific meetings need to be structured in a way that's really welcoming of different ideas, not simply, what do you think of this proposal? So, and TJ, I don't know if I missed anything from our discussion this morning.
Well, I'm not sure if you missed anything either, because my audio went and I just got back. So I didn't hear anything you said, Ed, but I'll trust you.
So I guess I'm just curious about whether there's any reactions to that. So
Ed, just to feed that back a bit, the idea is sector-specific meetings. The agendas for those meetings could be prepared or would be prepared in consultation with appropriate task leads from this committee. And the meetings would be held in what kind of format and in over what time frame?
Yep, so agree with what you just said. The agendas would be prepared with the folks from cross-sector as well. Excuse me, the specific sector leads. As Jane mentioned earlier, the invite list would also be heavily informed by the sector leads, and also hopefully by the work of Climate Council stakeholder as well, that it wouldn't just be, you know, the same usual suspects. We're actually getting folks who have not typically engaged on these issues. So with respect to the format, well, first off, I assume that they would be Zoom, not in person, you know, at this point. I'm very open to the format. I like the idea of essentially having two components. One is sort of a webinar type format where folks could, the sector leads could present, here's the ideas that we have, and then have the more targeted folks asking the specific questions of sort of panelists, and then opening that up. And I would definitely want CBI and others to have some input on how we get the how do we set up a format to actually be as encouraging as possible and not just a bunch of talking heads and reaction to those talking heads. So I guess I'm just saying, Rich, still early days for me as to how we actually structure that, but we want to be as engaged as possible.
All right, thanks. Does the department have an outreach or engagement consultant working with you on this too? So
yes, we do. It actually consists of Adamant Accord, so Cindy Cook, who is also working with Dave Lamont to help out on some of the more technical aspects as well. And one of the things that Dave Lamont has been, just for folks who might not be aware, Dave Lamont was planning director at DPS a little while back, very long history on these issues. And one of the things that we're considering or likely to do is have Dave and Cindy write up some sector specific, like a 2-pager introduction, high level, here's some of the issues that need to be considered. Still working on that, but so we have a little bit of the stakeholder and a little bit of technical stakeholder expertise that we'll plan to employ.
right, and Jane and Peter and Catherine, is there an expectation that CBI will be involved in that as well?
Not necessarily in writing like the briefs that Ed's speaking to, but I suspect and think that we've been thinking that CBI would lead the facilitation component of these stakeholder meetings.
Okay, so and it sounds like, Ed, you're open to suggestions about the best way to run these, you know, the format for them, so that we share the maximum amount of information and hear the amount of maximum amount of input we can probably get from them. So I think that's a real challenge, and for these technical topics. So I'm hoping CBI and maybe Adamant can get their heads together around a really good format for them.
Will do.
Yeah, right. And
Thanks, Catherine.
let me just say, while we're at it, you know, members of the committee who have suggestions about the best ways to do this should feel free to chime in. We should have some way of engaging ourselves in the design of it, so that they work as, you know.
And just to be clear as well, this is sort of, ideally, this is the department and Climate Council working jointly on this, not department is inviting specific folks to a department meeting. This is a joint meeting. And so just to be really, really clear about this, this is not that, TJ and I get to veto any of the ideas. This is, we all collectively work on this together to actually ensure that we're getting to the same goals, because there's so much overlap, especially on this area in the climate action plan and comprehensive energy plan, that we actually think this in particular is the best opportunity to work as closely together as possible on the stakeholder engagement.
Thanks, Ed. That's great. And let me just pause and ask whether other members of the committee have comments or questions around this. You didn't set, we talked about process, and you may have named a time frame, but I didn't hear it, or I didn't remember it. What's it?
So the meetings will likely, they won't start till earliest mid-July, but likely, towards end of July, early August. And the next step is we have a meeting to sort of plan the process on Monday, at which point I think task group leads and others would expect for us to reach out to them to pull them into the process.
All right. Oh, terrific. Thanks very much. So do you feel, Jane, it's sort of like you and Ed are the coordinators?
And it's been myself with Ed, TJ, and Ed Delhagen, as well as Claire also supporting us from Public Service Department. So for Public Service Department and me, but we'll figure out how to. CBI is joining us on the conversation on Monday too. So Catherine and David will be there.
Okay.
Jane, I'm happy to help as need be. So
okay, thank you.
And we'll cut the number of DPS folks going forward. This is some early brainstorming, but yeah.
All right. Well, committee members, any comments, questions? All right. Thanks, guys. The collaboration with the department, since we're trying, as Ed says, we're covering so much of the same territory, and we're trying to coordinate the energy plan with the climate plan. It's great that we're starting out this way. I appreciate it. Summer work planning process, Peter.
All right, Jane, I might ask you to share your screen. Thinking about work planning pieces that we've been discussing over the last few meetings, we kind of laid out our priorities for the next few meetings, the last meetings of this meeting, the next one, and then the two following. Jane has put together, based on other work plans that you're sort of laying out for us, what are kind of major decision-making points, what our at work activity, et cetera, would need to look like in order to get there. And so maybe Jane, if you want to walk through, since driving, it's easier to drive and explain at the same time.
Sure. So this has been a model that's now sort of being embraced by most of the subcommittees to just really think about how they use their time together in subcommittee meetings, especially leading up to the July Climate Council meeting, and the responsibilities of the subcommittees to present strategies and recommendations at that meeting, and then thinking about the task group work that needs to happen both at the meetings and in between to get us there. So this is really at a course level still. We looked at something even coarser, I think the last time or two times ago with you all, but I think it does just, recognize where you are and the decision points that you'll have to make in order to get to the presentation for the full council at the end of July. It also highlights, so I think there's no surprise with respect to the fact that, for today, transportation and non-energy are presenting, and then for the next meeting, strategies for buildings and thermal and electricity will go. And then the recognition that July 8th will be a busy meeting where you'll likely all have to think about a recognition of the changes that you make based on the conversations that you have with the subcommittees in your more substantive presentations today and at the next meeting. So we'll want to present any changes to the full subcommittee for consumption and approval at that July 8th meeting, recognizing that 2 weeks later, you'll have to have your full presentations ready for the council. The same thing, and TJ and others who are here actually representing some of the sector, the analysis work that's happening is, today you're going to see the business as usual model presented by SCI. I think that in order to get to sort of a final list of strategies and recommendations, you're going to have a conversation about how you're going to prioritize that work. So, and I know that Lauren and Richard and Peter and I have been having some emails about this, but we'll want to think about what that tool is and what you, or that if it's not a tool, the process you'll use as a subcommittee to put forward the final suite of strategies and recommendations for engagement this summer at the next meeting as well as the presentation of what your slide deck will look like and how you'll be pulling the information together. I know that for the meeting after that July 8th, if time permits, that the single mitigation pathway that SEI is working on too could be presented to you all. I put that in as a placeholder, as well as I'm hoping that the timeline for the public engagement plan, which is supposed to be the week of July 12th, but you guys don't have a meeting then. I'm hoping that that public engagement plan can be presented to you that Thursday, so that you have that feedback and work from this initial phase 1 of public engagement to include in your presentations for the final for the Climate Council for the end of July. Besides that, today we're talking about the stakeholder meetings. I think at your next meeting, you'll be able to provide a space to sort of process and think about what you learned from the workshop on the guiding principles and equity assessment and how we're going to move forward with implementation of that work. I think there'll be a role for prioritization of the strategies at some level. And then I'm trying to think, as far as we've thought about how we would deliberate and decide and what the decision points would be at each of the meetings. So again, I don't think there's anything really surprising here in this. It's just sort of lays you out what you can expect for the next few weeks of your meetings. And I'd be happy to share it. I don't think this went out, Peter, to the full subcommittee, but it probably makes the most sense after this and after this conversation to share it specifically with the task group leads thinking about it, but also the whole subcommittee to think about what's missing here and how they see their work fitting into this and where the sort of bunching points bottlenecks will be for them to get this work done. So I'll pause there.
That sounds great, Jane. And I would say that the thing I would add to that, obviously we're planning through sort of our next major sort of, or our primary milestone at this point, which is the sort of provision of initial thoughts to the full council for the meeting on the 26th. That's in my very bad term, the alligator closest to the canoe. And so we're working through that piece to how we get to that. We obviously, as we start to think about our work into August and September, we'll want to, as we go through more of the June meetings and into July, we'll want to be thinking through what's coming next. And at that point, we'll have some more clarity and then can continue to work this process moving forward.
That's great. Folks have any initial questions or feedback or thoughts on a process for using this kind of a tool?
I think it's very helpful, Jane, and I will encourage each of the task leads as well as our consultants to take a look at it. The next time you're having a conversation within your with your peers and see how it works. See whether or not there's something that you've got in the wrong box or needs to be accelerated or step back. It looks like a good, very straightforward way of organizing.
Great.
Gina, do you have a comment?
Yeah, the term final strategies by July 22nd is dangerous to me, and the devil will be in the details, and we will be far from done figuring out those details on July 22nd. So I don't know, maybe you
I
don't
really
mean
appreciate that. Thank
final
you.
strategies.
Final draft.
Yeah, there's got to be big caps.
Right.
Yeah, thank you.
Because that threw me off when I looked at it.
I might call them final preliminary because they really are, that we're in the we're in the put something forward to start testing concepts and getting things forward. They're really interim. They're not draft necessarily because we don't know where
No, they're not. No, their details will be far from figured out at that point.
So are everybody comfortable with, I don't even know what I said, draft preliminary?
Some,
I like,
Final
Okay.
preliminary?
I like that.
some words like that.
I'll make that change.
Thanks, Jane.
That's right. Interim, final, preliminary, draft concepts.
The end of the beginning.
Thanks, Jane. Our next topic is the LEAP business as usual assumptions, modeling, etc. Are we ready for that?
Hi, I'm all set.
Hi, and so I'll just take one minute here, Taylor, and as everybody knows, we've been hard at work setting up the LEAP modeling, or Taylor has really, and we're here today to give you some initial business as usual reference case results and kind of the first cut at what if we do nothing, what does the future look like? And I just want to note that yesterday we had about a little over an hour on a presentation that went into a little more detail than you'll see today. So I encourage folks to look at the Science and Data Subcommittee video once it's posted, if it's not already, if they want more detail, and then could reach out through me if you have more questions on the analysis. But the department, as part of its energy plan modeling in coordination with the Agency of Natural Resources, actually had started on this work for the comprehensive energy plan and realized, as you all know, that we want all the same assumptions and modeling for both of these plans. It would just be unwieldy and unnecessary to kind of have two different modeling efforts. So we've been working hard at setting up the business as usual reference case, and Taylor Binnington from Stockholm Environment Institute is here to kind of give you a high-level overview. And you can take it away, Taylor.
Taylor, before you hop in, I just want to say thank you all for those who contributed and provided help in developing these reference cases. This is an incredibly tight turnaround, and Taylor, you guys have done great work. Given the amount of stuff we needed to accomplish today, this conversation is shortened, but that doesn't mean that the input and desire and questions that won't come out of it won't be appreciated and be able to track in different form, as TJ mentioned. So thank you.
Great, thanks. Hello, everybody. So as TJ said, my name is Taylor Binnington, and I'm a scientist in the energy modeling program at SEI, or the Stockholm Environment Institute. It is my colleague and I, Jason Basie, who's the deputy director of our program. He and I, as well as colleagues at NESCOM, who have been developing this sort of reference case or business as usual trajectory, I guess, for an energy and emissions pathway or forecast for the state of Vermont. So I'm gonna, I've got about 30 minutes. I'm gonna keep this tighter, shorter than yesterday, and I see already there are some familiar faces actually on this call who were here yesterday. So apologies if there's any repeat material. And what I'll ask actually is just for the sake of time, if we could sort of hold our questions until the end of this presentation, and then I'll be happy to answer some of those. We can either do them in the chat or stick your hand up or something. So how do I advance? There we go. So a sort of very rough overview of what we have been doing and what we're intending to do for the state. So we at SEI, we're developing a sort of long range all the way to the year 2050 energy and energy related emissions model as well as a simplified model of non-energy greenhouse gas emissions as well, so that, in its entirety, we'll have a representation of emissions from all sources across the state. And we're developing this, an energy model using a piece of software, a platform that we actually developed at SEI in our Somerville office in Massachusetts, called LEAP, or the Low Emissions Analysis Platform. And LEAP is sort of a specialized accounting tool that lets us organize all of our sources of energy consumption and energy production, as well as the associated emissions that come from those different activities across the state. And we're going to use it to develop a number of different scenarios, beginning with all of the sort of hard work that goes into a business as usual type scenario. And then we can layer on top of that different assumptions for alternative scenarios, mitigation measures, mitigation pathways that achieve the state's reduction targets all the way through the year 2050. And then we can compare those scenarios on the basis of their, obviously of their total emissions, and also their costs. Ultimately, is where we're going with this. So I want to just include a quick snapshot, I guess, an overview of the whole process, broken down into different sorts of tasks that we are that we're performing in order to do this. Where sort of on the y-axis here, I've organized the different tasks into 5 different categories. The different scenarios that we'll be developing, the scope of the model, meaning what sectors it covers. Excuse me. Which energy related and then non-energy related emissions of greenhouse gases, but also of other air pollutants, and later eventually in this program of work of criteria pollutants that we'll be including, and then ultimately which types of costs we'll be incorporating into this model. And the arrows that I've highlighted in green just indicate kind of where we are today, or where we've gotten today. And the red arrows are the things that are coming up. So what I'm going to be showing you today is a reference case projection for all of the major final energy demand sectors, as well as a simplified kind of representation of the electricity sector, for the emissions that are associated with the consumption of electricity in Vermont. And I'll show you as well the associated greenhouse gas emissions from all of that energy production or consumption, and a simple trend projection as well from non-energy emissions, just to round out the whole picture. And anything else that's in red here, we're not going to be sort of seeing today. So even though the model that we have developed, it includes, it covers all of the final energy demand sectors. So that's, road transport, non-road transport, all types of buildings, residential and commercial buildings, industry, which includes, construction and manufacturing. I'm just going to focus on the big ones sort of today for the sake of time. And those are going to be just on-road transport and then buildings. So commercial and residential buildings, and talk a little bit about starting with just the assumptions that we've baked into our modeling of those sectors. I'll just list out really what has gone into, like, which assumptions, which exogenous forecasts, for example, we have included in that model, and then show you some of the key results that come out of that sector. And then we'll kind of conclude with some overall charts that show total emissions for the whole state at this stage in the project. I encourage you, if you're interested in the other sectors, briefly in industry or in the non-road transport, for example, you can look at the recording from yesterday. So I'm just going to dive in. The structure of this presentation, again, it's just sort of, I'm just going to start by listing out the things that are included in each of the sectors I'll cover today, and then show some key results.
So we've modeled our on-road transportation model by simulating the the number of vehicles, each sort of individual vehicle on the road in Vermont sort of currently, and then forecasted how that stock of vehicles will change over time in its composition of different technologies, and then the fuel consumption characteristics and the emissions characteristics of each of those vehicles over time. And we've built that using a reasonably current registration database that was provided by the DMV that gives us all of the vehicles that are on the road, or that at least were on the road in 2019, and all of the different technologies that are on the road. And then we've sort of supplemented that with some information about past vehicle registrations from the University of Vermont's Transportation Research Center. They've been really helpful partners with us in terms of like providing some information, as well as providing some outcomes of their own modeling. They have a really active and highly detailed transportation modeling program there. And we've borrowed some of their information, as well as some of their forecasts, actually. So UVM maintains a forecasted expectation for the number of VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, in the state, and we've adopted that forecast here. We sort of round out this model. We borrow information about the average mileage and the fuel mileage per year and the fuel economy of these different vehicle technologies from Argonne National Lab's Vision 2020 model, and this is a national level transportation model. And we use it as a source of really great sort of information for how individual vehicles of different technologies tend to consume energy. It also provides us with an estimate of and a forecast of ethanol and biodiesel blends in diesel and in gasoline. And we have borrowed. I'm going to jump to the second last point here. So we begin with this sort of representation of all of the vehicles that are currently on the road. And then we project, or we forecast, the amount of energy consumption from this sector in the future by simulating, or by assuming a number of sales of new vehicles in each year of our scenario. And the composition of those sales, or the market share, may vary in each year. And so for a lot of the technologies in our model, we've adopted a sales forecast that is borrowed from the US Energy Information Administration's AEO, or Annual Energy Outlook, the 2020 version of that. And that provides, sort of a national level expectation for the market share of different technologies being sold across the US. But then we've augmented that with a forecast for EV sales that is borrowed from Velco, as well as and then zero emissions vehicles from the multi-state memorandum of understanding for medium and heavy duty vehicles of which Vermont is a party. And then we've included information. We've calculated greenhouse gas emissions for this model in the same way that, using EPA's SIT, or state inventory tool, which provides us with a set of emission factors for each of the greenhouse gases. We've had to sort of augment that with some other emission factors as well. But this is just a rough kind of summary of what's in the transport model. And when we turn the crank, essentially, we have we're simulating vehicles of different technologies that are shown in the legend here by different vehicle classes. So light duty passenger cars, light duty trucks, medium duty vehicles, heavy duty vehicles. And I just wanted to sort of show you a highlight, or a snapshot of one of our results, which is just the total number of light duty cars and trucks on the road going into the future in Vermont, divided up among different technologies here. So you can see the technologies listed on the sort of lower axis. Just mentioned that EV A, B, and C, represent just electric vehicles, all electric vehicles of different range categories, 100, 200, 300 mile ranges, on average. And you can see that we're kind of assuming in our baseline scenario a shift away from primarily gasoline vehicles to to substantially towards vehicle electrification, and that just comes from wanting to harmonize this this assumption with the same assumptions that Velco has used in their IRP forecast. If we translate this into energy consumption and look instead at energy demand from that fleet of vehicles, you can see that total energy demand is decreasing quite a bit. As you would expect, if you're moving away from internal combustion engines to electrified vehicles, just because of the relative efficiencies of those technologies. So you can see that electricity figures more and more prominently just into the fuel mixture, mostly displacing gas and also some diesel. And this energy consumption gives rise to our on-road emissions forecasts. So these are the sort of direct, tailpipe greenhouse gas emissions that come from the combustion of all of those different fuels. And here I've chosen to display these results using a different sort of dimension by vehicle classes represented in our model, heavy and medium, and then the light duty cars and trucks. Okay. The other sector I want to cover today is the commercial building sector. Here we have, so this is all the commercial and institutional buildings across the state of Vermont, and we've tried to come up with an estimate of the total amount of floor space of all of these different buildings across the state. And we've divided that floor space into four sort of main categories. Old buildings, those that were built before the year 2007. And then we've differentiated between these old buildings that have heating and ventilation and air conditioning retrofits, or some sort of an insulation retrofit, or both of those retrofits. And then we've grouped those together with newly constructed buildings, so-called post-2007 buildings. So we have these sort of four different categories of commercial floor space represented in the model. And we've done that because each of these old buildings, as opposed to retrofitted buildings, as opposed to new buildings, tend to have different energy consumption characteristics. They use different technologies to heat. They have different levels of space heating and cooling, water heating demand, etc. And we've done this beginning initially actually with a framework that's been provided by the EIA, or Energy Information Administration's commercial building energy consumption survey. So these are sort of primary survey data that the EIA performs once every decade or so, that just give an indication of all of the different floor space in different regions of the U.S. and how each one of those square feet of floor space tends to consume energy using a mixture of different technologies. So that's kind of the bones of our commercial sector. But then we've gone and adjusted sort of those bones by including a number of Vermont-specific data items or forecasts that were available to us. So there was CADMAS recently conducted. Did I hear someone have a question? If it's urgent, go ahead. Otherwise, I might just ask for questions to be reserved until the end. Okay, I'll proceed here. So we've kind of augmented this buildings representation using a
couple times actually.
Oh, I don't think it's a question. If you don't have a question,
I'll mute everybody.
Thanks. Using the commercial buildings market assessment. This was another survey conducted just in Vermont, and that lets us get the space heating and the lighting and water heating technology mixture in the commercial building stock in Vermont a little bit more accurate. And then we've also added into our forecast of energy consumption the expected, I'll use the word expected lightly here, but the same number of heat pump additions that we would see from that Velco is assuming in their IRP. We've also included information about the effective energy efficiency programs, and then we calculate greenhouse gas emissions for this sector in the same way that is done for the state's greenhouse gas inventory, again, using the SIT, or the state inventory tool. So if I begin just showing you very quickly kind of an overview of what our representation of different floor space is doing here, starting for a couple of historical years back in 2015, extending all the way to 2050, you can see that gradually the old buildings are being phased out in favor of those with retrofits or of new buildings, which are represented by the blue category here. So we have this sort of transition in the envelopes, I guess, of different building energy technologies that's going on and sort of underlies this whole sector here. And what we see, though, is even though we have an assumption for some amount of growth in commercial buildings or in the floor space of commercial buildings, the energy demand across all of those buildings actually doesn't change a whole lot here. Maybe a little bit of an increase, but the relative sort of efficiency in the new buildings tends to kind of cancel out any growth in energy demand that you might see. And we have a picture here which doesn't really tell us a whole lot, except that not a great deal is changing in this sector. We're moving slowly away from heating oil, from fuel oil used as for space heating, in favor a little bit of wood, in favor of gas, and a little bit in favor of electrification, but not very much. We found that the Velco forecast assumptions for commercial buildings actually don't include really that many heat pumps for this sector. If we just drill in at only the energy demand for space heating, largely the same picture. Here you can see that a lot of that decline in fuel oil comes from the space heating end use. And meanwhile, that's in favor of increasing the amount of fuels in the other sectors, in the other fuels. And again, you can see in green here, just a very small amount of electricity being introduced. Very little additional electricity due to kind of a conservative estimate in the number of commercial heat pumps that we might expect to see. And I'll just show a picture of emissions. In this case, this is emissions divided up among different end uses in the commercial sector. End uses being space heating and space cooling, water heating, cooking, any end use in which you would combust a fuel that gives rise to emissions. And so largely flat-ish emissions that are happening in the commercial sector in this baseline here. Let me jump to residential buildings. Similar to the commercial sector, the residential building model that we have that we've built here is based on another EIA survey data product called REX, or Residential Energy Consumption Survey. And again, just like CBEX is a survey of commercial floor space in different regions of the US, REX is a survey of how different households consume energy. What share of them have adopted different technologies, how much energy those technologies tend to consume. And we've divided up this representation of energy consumption by urban and rural areas, by different types of houses, single family, multifamily apartments, etc., whether those are owned or rented. And then again, similar to the way that the commercial sector operates, we've gone and then adjusted a lot of the inputs based on Vermont specific data. So using the Vermont Residential Market Assessment that provides a more accurate picture of the heating and cooling and water heating devices in Vermont homes. Excuse me. And so what wood and wood pellet consumption as well. We've included using the residential fuel assessment. We've included an estimate for how energy efficiency programs, those that are that were for thermal fuels, for gas, and for electricity, how those efficiency plans might impact the fuels that are consumed in the residential sector, and so on. assumptions for the rate of shell retrofits as well that you might see. So there's a number of like underlying drivers. Maybe I'll just summarize this by saying that we have a large number of embedded forecasts for the mixture of technologies, the efficiencies of those technologies, the composition of the housing stock and their insulation, their weatherization characteristics. All of these ingredients go into our representation of the residential sector. And that gives us a picture like this, which shows a forecast for, again, just energy demand in the residential building sector, in this case, divided among end uses. And this tells kind of a different story than the commercial sector. And the biggest story that it tells, actually, if you can tell the red from brown here, is that space heating demand declines fairly significantly in this business as usual scenario in the reference case, because what we see is a sort of a gradual electrification happening, sort of a move away from gas and from fuel oil, most of which is used for space heating in favor of electricity. And that shift happens because we've adopted the same assumption for heat pumps, air source heat pumps, that is adopted by Velco in its system plan. And that turns out to be quite aggressive in terms of the number of households that would be using, or that would be assumed to be using, heat pumps in the future. So that displaces a lot of these heavily emitting fuels in favor of electricity, which is relatively more efficient. And so if I just show the direct greenhouse gas emissions that come from this sector, it's exactly what you might expect it to be based on the energy being consumed in these different end uses, where the emissions from space heating drop quite significantly. A quick note on our representation of electricity production in this model. So most of the effort that we've put into the modeling tasks so far has been focusing on those final demand sectors: transport, buildings, industry, which I didn't show you, but which we've included in the model. But also, in order to get a good estimate for how the state's total emissions would be projected into the future, we also have to model what's happening in the electric sector. How is electricity being produced, and what are its sort of embedded emissions? So in order to do that, this is an active kind of area of work that we're doing, I'm going to return to as soon as I get off this call, is we're going to be developing a model of all of the megawatts of capacity on the New England grid, and how those megawatts get dispatched to produce megawatt hours of electricity in order to meet our demand forecast. But until we get to that, we have sort of a simple representation of where electricity that is consumed in Vermont might come from. That's just broken among three different categories. Electricity that's provided from nuclear contracts, the existing ones that are already on the books, those that expire in 2034, that's the green color. The tier 1 and tier 2 renewable energy standard, which we assume is clean and emissions free, that's the large amount of blue. And then finally, anything that is not either of those energy sources comes from the rest of the grid mix. And we have an estimate for the average emissions intensity going forward to 2050 of that average grid mix. And that gives us the black line you see superimposed on the chart here, which is the emissions that come from Vermont's consumption of electricity. So when we layer all of this information together, our sort of rough estimate here for the electricity sector, which is under development, together with all of the emissions from the energy consuming sectors, many of which I've shown you already, together with an assumption for the emissions from non-energy sources, which I have not shown you, but the non-energy sources include things like waste, wastewater and municipal solid waste, agriculture, industrial processes, what happens when we landfill our air conditioners, that kind of thing, as well as land use change and forestry emissions. when we layer all of that together, we find a picture like this, which projects for us, the total economy-wide greenhouse gas emissions in carbon dioxide equivalent for the whole state. So the energy-related sectors are shown in the solid colors here, and then using sort of hashed bars, I've shown agriculture, waste management, and industrial processes. These are the non-energy emissions. And what you get when you add all those emissions up is the solid black line that inscribes the top of this chart. And when we layer on top of that the green line that's below the x-axis here, which represents past and a very simple forecast, just a trend sort of based projection for the negative emissions or the carbon sink that comes from land use change and forestry in Vermont. So when you adjust that solid black line by the green line, we get a net emissions estimate, which is the dotted line right through the middle of the chart here. So we've just superimposed all of these emissions over top of the three main Global Warming Solutions Act targets that in 2025, in 2030, and 2050. Those are the black dots on this chart. And this is sort of a capstone picture, I guess, of what our business as usual emissions forecast for greenhouse gases is looking like right now. So I will leave this chart up and maybe I'll invite some questions. If I'll leave it maybe to you, Jane, or to TJ for how you'd like to moderate those. If you'd like to go through the chat, or I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Well, I'm not sure exactly how much time we have here, and so I have to leave that to Catherine or Jane moderating. What I will offer is for folks who have questions who don't get them answered right now, to please reach out to me. I'll put my email in the chat, and then I can touch base with Taylor to get your response. And just to kind of highlight too the purpose of modeling, I just like to remind folks this. It came up yesterday as well, and I think it's good to talk about, is that we're looking at kind of these indicative results, and we know that if you pick a number in 2035, we know that that number is probably wrong, but we want to get an indicative sense of kind of where we're heading here, and we work really hard to kind of understand and put in our best estimate of what the business as usual is. I will say there's a question about the EV forecast. That forecast is derived from Drive Electric Vermont. They had kind of a low, medium, and high case. What was in the Velco long-range transmission plan, what was used there is kind of the expected case. And certainly there's, you can make different assumptions on what you think may happen as a business as usual. I know Ken Jones, you have a quick comment, and I think it's a helpful one as you think about this, and I know we're going long on our time, but go ahead.
Yeah, it is about this business as usual, and it's related to Velco. Velco's projections are to protect them from the future, and so it's both in terms of their use of EVs and switch over to heat pumps. They are. I don't think they would say that those projections will happen without policy changes going forward, but they have to be ready. In part, they base their projections on the Comprehensive Energy Plan, which also has targets of accelerated use of EVs and heat pumps. And again, I applaud them for planning for that future, but I don't want this group to think that is going to happen without this group doing some work. That's my main point.
Right, and I think that's a fair point, especially on EVs, where I'll note that it was the Velco got this forecast that was kind of well vetted as what we thought was going to happen, and then had a high forecast and a low forecast. And on the EVs, there's one, I think your point is is valid in that, you know, we appropriate money for incentives for EVs every year, and there's no guarantee that that money is going to be there going forward. On heat pumps, you know, there are requirements for utilities to pursue heat pumps. There's 20-year plans for efficiency support. And so it goes into, these are all fair questions. And I wanted you to say that here because I think it's a great example of the invitation for folks to comment and provide us comment and feedback on this, on what we think is a reasonable business as usual, and then, you know, later on, what are you know, reasonable scenarios going forward. And so, you know, there's a lot of room for interpretation, but you know, really good points, Ken, and that's why I know you raised them yesterday. I wanted you to raise them here so everybody could hear them.
Ken, thanks for raising that question. My question in the chat is a oblique way of asking the same question, really. Like, how much of the business as usual is just and underscoring the fact that we need to be aggressive about policies that either exist or are assumed to be expanded already. Jared has an additional point to make. Yeah, and Gina, I see, is making the same point.
Thanks, Rich. And first, I just want to thank TJ and Taylor for all the careful work that's gone into this and the great presentation. And apologies to those who were part of the Science and Data Subcommittee meeting yesterday. I want to make a couple of points there today that I made there yesterday, because I think they're really important, but also expand on them. One is I would just make a friendly amendment to the way that if he accepts it, that TJ introduced this. And I think you described it, TJ, as if we do nothing, what does the future look like? And I think we need to be appropriately humble that this is, if we do nothing, what might the future look like, with degrees of uncertainty that we need to acknowledge. And the way that I think about this is levels of uncertainty of different types of data. The highest degree of certainty that we have, and it's not even 100% perfect certainty, but the highest degree of certainty we have is where we stand in the recent future and what our past has looked like in terms of emissions and energy. The next highest level of certainty is the scale and pace of sectoral transformation and emissions reductions measures that will be required to meet the 2025 and especially and 2030 targets. A reference case scenario of what might happen in the future, given all of the assumptions and variables that go into it, is a useful planning exercise. But we need to be honest that there is not a high level of certainty on this, especially because some of the main variables involve trying to understand market transformation and market adoption rates of very new technologies. You know, we don't have much, you know, it was only in the last 5 or 6 years that there was over 1,000 EVs or over 1,000 heat pumps in Vermont. And it is notoriously difficult in these early market stages in the variability. Is there going to be geometric growth? Is it going to be linear? What role do incentives play? And so I think this can be useful, but I also want to caution us that an inappropriate and I think irresponsible use of the model would be to say, we can build a reference case scenario, including using some projections that has us meeting the goals, and therefore we don't need to focus on additional policy or programs. I'm not suggesting that anybody is saying that, but I want to make sure that I think the responsibility is use this to inform what we're looking at, but we need to make recommendations with a high degree of certainty that we're going to meet these targets. And it would not be appropriate or responsible to say, well, we don't need to do that, or we don't need to do that ambitiously and at the scale that we need to achieve in 2025 or 2030, because we can build a model with some questionable assumptions that might get us there. At least, you know, you see how close the 2025 dot is to the line there. So I just want to offer some of those thoughts. And I know we'll have more time to discuss later.
Thanks, Jared. Any other comments from the committee on this? I guess I will echo the thank you to the folks who put this together. It's going to be a really useful tool.
So Richard, if I might just quickly, I appreciate everybody's thoughts. Science and data and along with the public service department are really the ones digging into this in great depth. If you have thoughts, want to share, TJ is a great point of contact for that as both co-chair of that subcommittee and working on the CEP side. So please do that. We are getting this for help in our planning and sort of consideration of all the work that we're doing, but we're not the focal point for this work. There's a great number of things going on. Obviously, the 2025 and how much fidelity we have on that is really important. But as I think many of you have heard me say all along, that 2030 timeframe is really the hardest one to hit. You can see that pretty clearly in that chart. And so as we develop policy concepts, don't get too close, right? We need to be thinking that 2030 look out, because it is vital that we get moving towards that and not just start picking that up again as we get close to 2025. With that, we take public comment. If the public would please raise their hands if they're able through Zoom, we will get started. I believe Annette, I see your hand.
Hello, I have a couple of comments. This is Annette Smith with Vermonters for a Clean Environment. It's just occurred to me that I guess I've been following a lot of the different subcommittees, and the focus mostly seems to be on technology, or I'll put it rather simply, buying new stuff. Is there anybody looking at education about changing behaviors? And where does that fit into the whole discussion? And so then on the front about technology, I will note that this focus on electrification is in a way taking away from some other potential technologies. For instance, I have solar hot water. It is the most direct way for me to get off fossil fuels. I literally go in the house and turn a handle to go to, actually two handles, to go from an instant propane hot water heater to a solar hot water heater. And the solar really, really works in Vermont. It's cost effective. I'm aware of some people who are attempting to market it. I don't see any support from anyone for solar hot water. And that the electrification piece concerns me too, because I do live with a renewable energy system. And so these last few hot days, I've been looking at ISO New England, and the peak load was about 23,000 megawatts. And at 7 o'clock at night on these hot days, there's like 6% renewables, of which the majority is burning wood or waste. And so I am intimately familiar with the challenges of dealing with a renewable energy system, and especially what happens when it's dark and when the batteries run down and we have days and days of really cloudy weather. So I just want to flag that I'm concerned that this total focus on electrification is leaving out some other aspects of it. And I thank you very much for your.
Thanks, Annette. Steve Crowley.
Hi. I appreciate Ed's comments there. I would agree 100% with her. What I'd like to do is to, I guess, call attention to a paper that several of us submitted through your public portal back in the early days of the public portal, so near the top of the list, that raises a number of questions that I think are important for you all to answer, that will play heavily into some of the underlying assumptions in the model that we've just seen described. Some of those questions there are kind of three categories that I'll just summarize briefly, and happy to talk more and refer you to that paper. But one is the missing emissions that I think everybody agrees are missing from the current models, which are things like emissions from biomass electricity, which are counted as zero, but are absolutely not zero. Emissions from large hydro, which are absolutely not zero and yet counted as zero. Emissions from fugitive methane up the fuel cycle, which is recognized by the best science that's out there now to be approximately double what we now count as burner tip emissions from burning methane. And that applies both to thermal energy in state and to imported electricity from gas-fired power plants from the regional grid. And probably more, those are the ones that come to my mind. But those areas are missing completely from the modeling, and I'm not sure if that will change things, but I'm pretty sure it will. The second area is what happens to renewable energy credits? These, non-electricity imports of attributes of which it's not clear how from the renewable energy and into a carbon accounting scheme. Legal description of how it happens. So the assumption that it happened is pretty speculative. And so that's a whole set of questions. What happens to those facts? Which makes a huge difference in terms of the regional and so on, different resources that really continue to require the burning of natural gas.
It looks like we've lost Steve. Maybe we can ask him to speak to us if we have time at the very end of our program. We are behind schedule, so I'd like to move us along. Steve,
have I returned to your meeting here?
Sorry, you have returned, but you were breaking up quite a bit, and I'm going to ask you to, because we're behind time, to hold the rest of your comments for the end of the meeting, if it's okay. Thank you. Our next topic is a non-energy emissions presentation from Peter.
Great. So this is a combination of work that's gone on. Appreciate the participation of Lauren Oates and staff members from the Agency of Natural Resources and the Agency of Agriculture in developing these concepts, in working with others to think them through. They are, again, we're in the sort of preliminary phase of developing concepts. You'll recall as we walked through the emissions inventory data in the sectors that we are talking about in the non-energy are agriculture, the waste sector, and in industry. There was the fossil fuel industry that is primarily fugitive emissions from our distribution and transmission lines of natural gas, which the building sector agreed to take on as part and parcel of their work, as you'll recall. And as you'll recall, I mentioned that the last meeting, we have sort of delegated the emissions reductions concept development in the agricultural sector to the Ag and Ecosystems subcommittee, and they will be bringing ideas to us forthwith, but they are not ready for today. So we are primarily talking about two distinct sectors, the waste sector and the industrial sector. And further, as you'll recall from the data, that the solid waste sector has largely met its emissions reductions already for future requirements. And so you asked us to bring forward concepts around the wastewater sector and what could be done there to understand what its cost effectiveness might be. And then in the industrial sector, our two primary sources are ozone depleting substitutes, so the ODS substitutes, primarily in refrigerants. And then our other primary source is from chip manufacturing in the state and the use of high global warming potential chemicals there. So just want to set that as background. We have 8 concepts that we want to discuss with you today and get your feedback on moving forward. We shared those as part of the template spreadsheet that we put together and shared with you this morning. It should be on the website for those who are following along from the public who would like to take a look at them. I will share my screen now, but I just wanted to, before we jump into the spreadsheet, which is difficult to read at times. I just wanted to sort of set those parameters for you all.
And Peter, before you go through that list of 8
Thanks, Catherine.
items, could I just tee up some questions for people to think about as you're going through this? Because at the end, we do really want to focus on sort of what people questions are, that something they don't understand. So basically clarifying, is there anything missing here? Any major strategy or pathway you see that's missing? Any stumbling blocks or challenges that you think will need to be addressed in this next refinement of these strategies? If you have any questions or concerns about the underlying assumptions and analysis that you see embedded in these proposals, please raise those. And I think the last one, we want to particularly find out if there's other data or analysis you think you would need as a subcommittee at the next stage, and something that maybe even some of the contractors could take on that could help you, better understand or feel more confident that these are actually going to achieve goals. So just putting that out there, because I like to have people thinking about it as you're speaking.
Thank you, Catherine. I got ahead of myself. Thanks for laying that out. All right, let me pull those up now. Can everybody see that spreadsheet? Oh. I moved screens and it paused my sharing, so I just have resumed that. So hopefully you all will be able to see that. I think that's what happened the last time I was trying to make edits to the template with you all. Silly Zoom doesn't understand what I want to do. All right, so we'll start. I'm going to start in the waste sector. We have 4 recommendations relative to wastewater. 2 of them are specific to the emissions sector of the wastewater sector, and then 2 are captured in other sectors but are relevant to the operations of a wastewater treatment facility. The first 2 recommendations really revolve around the creation and emission of methane gas created at wastewater treatment facilities. We have several facilities around the state that have anaerobic digesters. Components of those, largely those are then flared, but we have some with non-functioning flares. So they're at first and foremost, getting to the point where each one of those systems has a functioning flare so that we are not emitting that methane gas into the environment is a great place for us to be beginning and to make some key work. The second piece of that is to be developing opportunities for more anaerobic digestion at wastewater treatment plant, and ideally getting to the point where we're converting more of that methane into energy generation on site for use of the facility or use in the community as a whole. But there are some opportunities there. There are some aging facilities that are going through revamps that we have some opportunity to capture some of that fugitive methane emission that plays a pretty critical role, at least the emissions in this sector. And I'll go through some of the more detail, and we guys want to go over the high level of these ones. And then the next 2 relate to the operations of these facilities. We have a large number of our wastewater treatment plants for many communities are some of the largest electric energy consumers in the municipality or for the municipality. And so trying to get those systems to be optimized and run as efficiently as possible is really a critical component. We have done some work on that to date, but it really is an opportunity to use energy more efficiently in a large user base, and trying to drive, and as we talk about equity considerations, trying to make sure that we drive those opportunities to those communities who are most hard hit and have real hard time affording the wastewater and wastewater services they have. And then we spend a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of weight on our roads moving the residual biosolid from the facility. And there are other issues associated with that, but primarily what we're thinking about here is most of the weight associated with that material is in the residual water weight. And if we can cut down on that water weight, then we can cut down significantly on the transportation emissions associated with that movement around the state. And so just wanted to throw those out there as two sort of ancillary ideas that we'd love to have to be included in the other sectors, but that were really heavily weighted towards the waste sector, and want to make sure that we included those. Okay. I'm going to move on to the ozone depleting substances, where we have, yes, sorry, it's not scrolling very fluidly. So we have 4 ideas here. Really, there are 3 relative to use of refrigerants, and then 1 continuing to work with global foundries to reduce their process emissions, and really trying to work on finding alternatives and other ways with them to manufacture chips in the state and to reduce those emissions of high global warming potential substances. In terms of refrigerants, California has worked on a refrigerant management program as one of the key ways in which they're going to reduce emissions from this sector. These are primarily HFCs, hydrofluorocarbons, that are emitted that were CFC replacements back when when the Montreal Protocol came into effect, when we were having issues with ozone depletion. The HFCs replaced the CFCs, and now we end up with a different set of challenges. So trying to work through how we manage those. And then also for line 10, you'll see it's really about how do we reduce the end of life emissions by making sure that your refrigerators and other things are disposed of and managed properly. And then thirdly, how do we help incentivize the use of other refrigerants that don't have the global warming potential concerns of HFCs? And then finally, for the global foundries themselves have put forward different goals of trying to meet reductions in their HFC use or their global warming, high global warming potential chemical use. But they have made some progress, and they're getting us some more refined data to help sort of understand what the reference case looks like there versus what we really need to do. And as you'll recall, they're as a single entity, a major source of emissions within that industrial sector, and a significant contributor for the sector as a whole in Vermont. And so those are the 8 basic concepts. I'm happy to start there and maybe think about questions Catherine has, and then I can go into more detail on kind of where we're going and some of the key considerations, primarily around equity. I think they're most important in terms of trying to work through.
Great, Peter. And I'm just going to facilitate this discussion so that both Peter and Richard can weigh in as well. And wanted to frame this discussion as we jump in to make sure that everybody understands, if it was, I think it might have been said at the top of the hour, but that we're not endorsing any of these. We're not, this is not a decision-making point by any means. It's really, and you'll have an opportunity to talk about these in much more depth again in not the next meeting, but the meeting after in July. So really, this is the opportunity for you to make sure you understand what's there already and encourage consideration of anything you think might be missing. So those are the 2 first important things we want to talk about. And then if there's some particular analysis or data that would help you to better understand this, that they can be thinking about as they move forward. So with that, let me just see if we have folks. I see Liz, you have your hand up first.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Thanks, Peter. I was thinking that maybe on the wastewater treatment plant set of recommendations, the electricity sector one actually is a good opportunity to at least kind of think through how the cost benefit analysis would work, because if we in the electricity sector recommendations come up with, for example, and just as by way of example, strengthening state law so that the reference case bump that otherwise was shown there as long-term contracts roll off and current 2032 res goals are met, make sure that that doesn't actually happen and that we actually keep that line going down and reach 100%. If we were to do that, it would make the cost benefit of the wastewater treatment plant electricity recommendation as to carbon savings less attractive, although of course it would still save municipalities money. So I guess and probably help with efficient operations and other things. So I guess the question is, have you thought about how this gets sort of further filled out with cost benefit and maximum carbon savings for the buck in mind?
So that's a great question, Liz, and I fully I have lots of the same pieces. I think one in response to our sort of first round of brainstorming, the subcommittee had asked us to bring forward these concepts as things to test and to things to have the consultants sort of look at in terms of developing that cost effectiveness curve. Because I agree with you, there are lots of other factors at play, and it may mean that those are not as cost effective, but they also have other, pretty huge benefits, just as the cost of the cost of operating those systems as a whole is massive.
Yeah, for sure.
And if we can cut down on some of that, then it frees up capacity elsewhere and whatnot. So yeah. So the short answer to your question is we're trying to get these in the mix so that the consultants can consider and go from there.
Joey and then Richard.
Thanks, Peter. I have two questions for you. Let me just ask them and then maybe you can tackle them. First, are there any things in terms of these strategies that are like big challenges, market-based challenges, or other things that we should be aware of that may make it more like reality check us and their ability to be implemented? And then, and then secondly, and I have a question for you. Did you consider, or what role might there be just in sort of in the general arena of like education, conservation, waste reduction strategies at the sort of consumer level? It seems to me kind of like the point that was raised before, Annette, and I think it keeps coming up, like just like the value of just conservation strategies and using less.
Certainly that so to the latter point, that is been key in the solid waste sector. I've not yet figured out how to create conservation measures in our wastewater sector. But certainly, it's a big factor and been a key to our sort of ongoing success in the emissions from the solid waste sector, and was something we should be rightly proud of as a state.
Yeah, I mean, just anecdotally, we thought we had an efficient shower head. We got a new one, and it's, I mean, literally just small stuff like that, and we're just one family without a teenager yet.
Well, as now having two, I can tell you that your water bill will go way up. There are certainly conservation measures there. I think most of we've done a fair amount of work in that space now. Obviously, there's always more to be done, but sort of as a particularized emissions reduction strategy, I'm not sure it would have a huge impact, especially because these facilities are designed for peak flows, and so they are on an average day-to-day basis are not necessarily operating as efficiently as possible, and if we further draw down that demand, then that's just going to exacerbate some of those issues. And then to your first question, the obvious answer to that one is where sort of globally microchip manufacturer is going and sort of what that means. The piece that I want to highlight for all of you is that in looking at in more detail the sort of the high global warming potential emissions issue in that sector didn't really become an issue until post 1990 because they were using other substances, and now so that really kind of the first time that shows in our baseline data is in 2005, and so they're at 0 in 1990, and so that's going to be something that we have to consider as a subcommittee as a whole. Is to things have changed and uses have changed and different things have come online since 1990 in the sort of gasoline powered vehicle, fuel oil and propane world. Those things have been around for a long time. That's not the case with everything else. So we're going to have to figure out how we pull some of those different threads together. But that's still an issue for sure around where the sector and where the sort of market is going for chip manufacturer and what they're doing. But they are continuously seeking to sort of refine those processes to make them better.
So let's move to Richard and then Chris. And Liz, you have your hand back up, so I'll get to you next. Nope. Okay. Richard and Chris.
So I'm thinking about commercial coolers, home freezers, refrigerators that particularly older ones that may be leaking refrigerants. And the same is probably true of automobiles. And whether we would need to have a program to accelerate the removal of those units and the proper disposal of the HFCs or CFCs in them. And is that a program design element that you've considered?
Yes, so we have existing, sort of refrigerant containing appliance take back or, sort of end of life programs now. Obviously, we need to make sure that they're working as well as possible. The leaking piece is a bit more complicated. That's where speaking to changing out those refrigerants, or for either changing out the refrigerants or changing out the systems with refrigerants that are not causing as many issues would be most effective. But that's where the line, the idea number 7, line 11 comes from, is to try to figure out ways to substitute either within an existing system and managing for leaks as well as we can, and then into replacing systems altogether. And we're just digging into the refrigerant management program, similar to what California has done, but that may be an opportunity as well.
There are a number of energy efficiency programs that have not waited for end of life, but have attempted to get people to turn in their fridge or their freezer and have incentives to get a much more efficient one. It seems like if we can address both the consumption of the unit and accelerate the removal of the harmful HFCs or CFCs in them, that it's a double-barreled benefit.
Yes, I agree with you.
Chris, you're up.
I can't remember if I've mentioned this before, but one of the things, and there's probably research on this, but I know when I was working on my master's thesis, I looked at the efficiency of shrimp trawls. And as they would increase the energy efficiency of the trawls, what would happen is the fishermen would pull them faster and basically expend the same amount of energy. Well, they would basically run right up to the level of the fuel costs that they had before. I've seen this in other things too. You see it even with the new EVs that are coming out, right? They're more powerful, they go faster, and I know that's to appeal to the consumer, but I think that's one of the limitations we're going to have. I think it's just a human tendency to even where you can find efficiency, so then kind of consume up back to that level of efficiency that or level of consumption that you had before that you could afford. So I mean, I think education and conservation measures are absolutely going to be part of the puzzle, but I really don't know, from a realistic standpoint, to what extent they're going to get us to where we need to be. So I'm not saying they're bad. I'm just not sure how much we're going to find in that realm, just based on the way we behave as creatures.
Thanks, Chris.
And I was just, I was on the presentation from SEI yesterday for the BAU, and that point came up there too, Chris, where, so these back balance energy consumption, is that going to be taken into account in the modeling? I can't tell you what the answer was because I can't remember specifically, but that's been brought out to their attention. I saw a hand up and then it went down. Any other questions, ideas, contributions?
That was Colin Smythe, who is the lead person around greenhouse gas inventory in Vermont. So he might have a thought,
Yeah.
and I would welcome him to add it.
Colin.
Hi. Thanks, Peter and Catherine. I just wanted to respond to Richard's points a little bit. I totally agree with you, Richard, and that's kind of what lines 5 or points 5 and 7 that Peter referenced are trying to get at. The refrigerant management program, essentially, and as Peter said, we're still kind of digging into the details of this, but it essentially kind of registers all systems above, I think California's limit is 50 pounds of certain of the refrigerants, high global warming potential refrigerants, and it kind of requires yearly reporting to determine if those systems are leaking, how they're performing, that kind of thing. And if they are leaking, requires them to make those fixes to stop those leaks from happening. And there may be others, probably others at at Efficiency Vermont who know way more about this than I do, but we've had some preliminary discussions with them on this topic anyway. But so that's kind of the idea behind that for the larger systems. And then the incentives piece of it was kind of trying to get at the other thing that you were talking about, I think, which was kind of the smaller systems, or this all kind of intertwines with Act 65 and the rulemaking, where kind of the phasing down of high global warming potential HFCs in Vermont for kind of all newly manufactured equipment. But Act 65 doesn't get at kind of the existing equipment. And so the incentives idea was to kind of get at those existing systems that maybe are smaller than what would be covered by the refrigerant management plan, but could still be leaking and still creating a problem. And so incentivizing them to switch over to a lower global warming potential gas. That's the idea behind that. So
Thank you.
Wanted to throw that in there.
And I saw that David Hill put in a link, or I don't know if it was a link, but a reference to testimony on refrigerant management in New York. I don't know, David, do you want to say anything more about that?
It's from Allie White at VEIC, and it provides, it was in a case in New York, but it provides good background on the refrigerant management options and recommendations. So just as a reference.
Great, thank you.
And I had a question too, just on the wastewater. Is there, how much wastewater, kind of decentralized wastewater, are there opportunities and or issues with emissions around septic or conversion of decentralized and decentralized, assuming the costs of centralizing all of the rural wastewater is not very attractive, but I'm just wondering if that's at all, if there are any changes anticipated in central versus decentralized, and then if there are any opportunities for decentralized systems to reduce emissions.
Maybe Colin, can you speak to whether or not the inventory reflects emissions from the on-site wastewater treatment?
It certainly it certainly incorporates that distinction between the centralized systems and the kind of percentage of the population on septic. I think that probably Amy would have to be the one, or maybe Peter, but to speak to any possibility of decentralizing systems. That's a little beyond.
I think David was talking about going the other direction, which, I think, thinking, Chris Campany can speak to this better than probably just about anybody, but the idea of small villages where, village centers where there's an opportunity to consolidate some of those on-site systems into either, sort of combined larger septic system type systems, or for a small scale wastewater treatment plant. Those are still, I think, primarily gonna be in-ground systems still, David, for the most part going forward, unless that has the capacity, the system has the capacity for needs for a larger system. And so I think you're gonna end up with largely the same sorts of emission profile. And if we're gonna build new, then we're gonna try to build things that are, most efficient from that perspective.
Chris, I see you nodding your head. Did you want to add anything?
Peter pretty well covered, and I just assume, well, I assume everybody knows that, to achieve the compact settlement, that we're going to have to achieve all kinds of different policy goals and objectives. We're going to have some kind of, more centralized water and wastewater. But if you look at like even the Rich Earth Institute, urine diversion systems, which takes a more regenerative approach, there you're saving energy and you're also cycling nutrients, and that plays into the regeneration concepts that we're talking across a number of different sectors too. So Vermont has a chance to be really innovative in this. That part of the challenge is, of course, work is having it fit within the regulatory rubric.
All right, Jared, I'm going to give you the last question for this session, this go round.
This is kind of a broader question on the overall approach. So if someone has one very specific to these proposed strategies, I'll yield the floor, but want to be able to.
You've got you're the last hand up.
Okay, so I just want to note that, and we've circled back to this many times, this language in the Global Warming Solutions Act, 592, Section D2. It talks about the plan that we produce providing for greenhouse gas emissions reduction that reflect the relative contribution of each source or category of source of emissions. And we've had conversations about, what year are we pegging that relative contribution share or ratio to? And I think that it's a really fair conversation. Should we use, what year should we use? Regardless of what we do, those relative contributions or the proportional share of emissions that's coming from each sector is different in different years. And I think Peter started this off by saying, the waste sector has already met its proportional share of reductions, which is likely true if the reference year is 2005 or 1990. But so I'm not proposing, I just think we need to get clarity on how either we're interpreting this or be presenting information in ways that show how different it would be based on different interpretations for that reference year of what we're asking for proportional sectoral. I'd be happy, I'm going to volunteer to update the spreadsheet with the latest emissions inventory data that came out from ANR so folks can see the differences based on what we choose for a reference year, but it is not explicitly stated in statute, but it leads to different outcomes. EAN's decision when we did our emissions reduction pathways analysis was to use the latest available data and use 2018 as the reference year. So in that case, getting to 2025 and 2030, the waste sector would be responsible for meeting 2% of the overall emissions reduction. That leaves aside this much broader question of potentially conflicting or at least tension between different parts of the Act and the guidance in them, because there's other parts of the Act that focus very specifically on the importance of cost-effective emissions reduction. And it is not necessarily true that proportional by sector emissions reduction is going to be the most cost-effective. There are some sectors that the emissions reduction costs are much higher. So I feel like this keeps it's useful probably to update that information and share it again so that we can have a consistent way of approaching this, because at the end, when we're trying to add all these things up, we need to make sure either that we're using a consistent approach or that we're aware of different approaches and showing how things add up differently depending on what approach you use.
I don't know if anybody has a specific response to that, or more, it's just a keep it on your radar to be answered.
And I'll share an updated spreadsheet so folks can get a sense of like what this practically means ahead of our next meeting.
All right, that'd be great.
But I think for the most part, Jared, my response, I mean, I have a specific response to your concept that we've talked about before. But in terms of where we are in the process, I think we need all the data on the table to be able to see how things compare and decide to what faith, you know, because that really is, it's a directive to us, but it's written in a way that feels more like guidance, right? That's your starting point, and then evolve from that in the plan rather than this is a hard, fast must do in each achieve those things in each sector.
Yeah.
Thanks, guys. Catherine, thank you. And I would like us to take a break now. We're scheduled for 15 minutes, but we're behind time. So can we keep the break to 10 minutes, or do people have a problem with that?
And Joey, could you just join a couple minutes early and we'll get your slides up and ready to get started so you don't lose too much time on your presentation either. That works for you.
Sure. I emailed those to Peter, but I'm happy to join early. So yes, I'll be momentarily.
Okay, I've got 12:49. Let's make it 11 minutes and come back and top of the hour. Thank you. All right, those folks that are within listening range, we've got a little over a minute before we start up again.
Gina, are you part of the presenter team? Okay, great.
That's why I'm
Catherine, did you get the slides?
Well, I don't know who is showing the slides. I did see the slides earlier. Yeah.
We have slides.
Mhm.
I just don't know if you're sharing your screen or if
Yeah, that's a question for Peter, I guess, or I don't know, somebody.
I don't know how it works, but whatever works for you.
okay.
Yeah.
Well, I can bring them up because I think I have them open.
Thank you. We're going to start with the PowerPoint one, I think.
Yeah. Okay.
Definitely.
All right. Let me see if I have share screen capabilities.
A real plus for them.
It looks like I do. Okay, you see it?
Yes, thank you.
Let's go slideshow mode.
Yeah, we can see it. Thank you, Catherine.
So do you control the slides or can?
I can do that, yes.
Okay, so we should just say,
Yeah.
next slide.
Yeah, and let me put it in slideshow mode.
Thanks,
There you go.
Catherine.
Oh, it seems like I lose. There's something I have to do here if I've forgotten what. Let me change a setting before we get too far ahead here.
Hey, and Richard, just remind me if we are a little late, how much time we have, because I think we're very eager for a conversation with you all too. So we can adjust.
Right, including public comments on this part, some of which we may have already heard, we're going to be, we got an hour altogether.
That's good.
Jane's back, Peter's back. Looks like you got 21 participants. I think we're ready to start.
Okay. Let me try this, see if this works. Nope, that didn't work. So what happens is it just obscures my screen, so I can't see the rest of the PowerPoint. I mean, the rest of the Zoom, but let's go forward with this if you're ready to start.
That sounds great. We'll start just because we like transportation, our largest sectoral greenhouse gas emission sector. There's a lot to cover. So Gina and I very much look forward to digging into this with you. I'm going to start pretty high level, turn it over to Gina and our 1-2 part punch approach thus far to dig into the substance and the strategies. But just sort of setting the context for you all, we've sort of landed in sharing these initial thoughts for you for this conversation, informed by sort of some small group regular meetings of, experts and transportation providers, others. So sort of really looking to build off a network of folks in Vermont who are doing this work, and we're eager to continue to expand that and also engage others who've played very heavy roles in the transportation sector included. We've also, this input is informed by sort of our analysis of other, Vermont state plans, a comprehensive energy plan, Vermont climate plans, other work in neighboring states and elsewhere. We, as you will see, we're going to go through this PowerPoint, but we looked at the council's recommended template, the assessment tool. We have begun to populate it, but really we're going to start with sort of a PowerPoint and put some of our high level strategies into more of a Word doc because it's fairly unwieldy at this point, but looking forward to getting down to that level of analysis. And we, this really is sort of an estimation of an initial level sort of importance priority for each pathway based, again, primarily on greenhouse gas emission benefits and outcomes. So again, starting point for this conversation based on historic work, outreach, but also knowing that we are very much looking forward to an overlay of the Just Transitions work and the principles that they've created and the thinking about, how we might advance these recommendations or others, or sort of tool the different policies or programs to ensure equity outcomes. So it's preliminary, going to require a lot more review and comment from a wider variety of stakeholders. So next slide, please, Catherine. We have a lot of goals. I think I don't need to read everything on this screen, but again, we are looking at, since transportation is our largest sector of greenhouse gas emissions output, really looking at like sort of compendium different strategies that are going to reduce emissions in this sector in a very equitable way, balancing sort of cost effectiveness and also bringing benefits into Vermont, considering that, very liquid drop of fossil fuels that we use to get where we need to go is imported. So we really wanted to look at how do we, recognize that and garner some benefits from a transition to a more diversified 21st century transportation system. So really also looking to, and we're very much excited about the new consultants that are going to help us in this cross-sector mitigation work, looking at quantifying the different sort of strategies, making sure that this is quantified estimation, moving us towards our greenhouse gas emission reduction requirements, but also in a really thoughtful way. Also recognizing that this is sort of an iterative process. We've begun sort of the outreach and engagement, and our goal, again, informed by the principles that we're looking forward to applying, that Just Transitions laid out, is really to sort of look through these different strategies and refine our approach based on stakeholder input and that really important equity lens. So, and starting first with what we know and the fuels and the technologies that are widely available, and for us, as you will see, based on the Energy Action Network analysis, which we have embraced as a foundation to build from, and we look forward to really digging into the business as usual assessment that SEI just shared with us. I'm very much looking forward to a deeper dive on that. Also, so looking at like what we know and informing our recommendations based on that. So our core focus being high efficiency and electrification. Also considering other things as the assessment tool, required importantly is sort of what's the ease of implementation, how do we build off existing programs, how do we design, strategies that incent the kinds of reductions that we aim to secure and sort of really send signals or otherwise, strategies that sort of disincent or behaviors that we want to begin to transition away from. It's really also important to recognize that, as we know, transportation, issues do not, start or stop at community, state, regional borders. These solutions are in the context of, and we need to be considering strategies related to, what's the federal landscape, what are the multi-state regional approaches, so aligning these strategies in that way. But we also have identified Vermont has and needs to continue to play leadership roles in sort of multi-regional, national arenas. And we're looking at sort of, the California emissions and ZEV programs, working with NESCOM, exploring the Transportation and Climate Initiative, et cetera. Really quickly, just wrap up before the next slide, is sort of really thinking about how, leadership, looking at our own state fleet and what we can be doing on transportation interagency wise at the state level. Next slide, please, Catherine. And then for us, really importantly, I think we've spoken to this, but there is this pretty significant, potentially once in a generation opportunity with federal dollars coming into the state, whether that's ARPA dollars, American Rescue Plan Act dollars, or potential new ensuing federal stimulus dollars or other dollars down the road, federal funding that can help really sort of ground this moment. This is a very unique moment, but also further work. But I think we're also recognizing that the scale of the transition, both the scale and the pace to get to 2025, 2030 and beyond, very well may require sustainable funding source to drive programs and achieve goals, which include the equitable transition. And a few other things, just growing the state's investment in on-highway transportation systems, like looking at very different modes of getting people where they need to go, getting goods where they need to go. And then foundationally, for us, obviously, we need to really consider sort of our land use goals and making land use and sort of smart growth design principles, investing in downtowns, compact community centers is going to be fundamental to our long-term success. So that is a very core underpinning of this work. And I'm going to turn it over to you now, Gina, because we're going to get into the sort of substance, and there's a lot here, but we very much look forward. I think I can speak for both of us, opportunity to dig into these with you. So Gina, you want to take it away?
Sure, thanks, Joey. It was really important for us in our group to have a set of goals before we started writing down pathways and strategies, and I really encourage the other groups to do that. You can't just launch into solving the problem. Maybe it's the planner in me, but you've got to figure out where you're trying to get to. So that's what we did with that last list, and we really welcome input on that. So we broke down this vast array of transportation. It's huge. It's vehicles, systems, roads, bridges, transit, rail. It's a huge part of our lives and our economy. We had to break it down into some pathways. So we looked at what EAN had done, and we're really interested in those numbers and that system of looking at the issue. But at the same time, we don't want the numbers to drive our opportunities. So this is what we came up with. It's based on kind of what we're doing now. It begs the question of, how much more should we be doing? How much less? How much differently? And biggest of all, in my view, is what's missing. Because this is all kind of based on the data. It's based on what we know. Is there something that we don't know that we need to include? And that'll become evident as we do our public involvement and as we move forward. So the basic pathways are electrification, which we've all talked about, and that's for light duty. And when I say light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles, and also bikes, motorcycles, ATVs, snow machines, there's all other ways of getting around that may fall into this category of electrification of vehicles. Then there's this idea of increased fossil fuel efficiency. And that means the cars that are fossil fuel, the traditional, if you will, can we make that whole fleet more efficient? And for both the light duty and the heavy duty fleet. Low carbon fuels, and this is things like biodiesel, ethanol, hydrogen, you name it. Then reduction of single occupancy vehicle trips through increased transportation choices. People call that, they term it, and we've talked already this morning about behavior. To me, it's behavior, but it's also investment. There's a significant amount of investment that needs to go on in order for us to move into the future with more transit, rail, better bike ped, whatever. The big issue, in my view, is compact land use design, and it really is the driver of the feasibility of the other pathways, and it's not something we're going to forget about now. We've been talking about it through the state land use priorities for years. We got to keep doing it. We got to keep doing it. We got to keep doing it, doing it more intensively. And then there are a few other necessary things that I'm going to talk about as we get into it. So let's go to electrification. And this is the big one. And what we did here was, we did not plug in the numbers, Ian's numbers yet, but we want to, and we want to see if there are other numbers like the ones we were talking about this morning in terms of what's ahead of us. And I'll give you an example. Right now, EAN says and this is for light duty electric vehicles, that we've got roughly 3,000, depending on how you count it, of light duty electric vehicles on the road today. By 2025, we need 47,000. By 30, we're going to need 120,000. Now that gives you an extent of the change that we're going to need. Of course, we also learned from the LEAP model, we don't need to do much, and we could get there, but that's something we got to dig into more. So we all know why it's important. The technology's available right now. We can walk into a dealership and buy a car. The manufacturers are all excited about it. At least they are in the press. Costs are coming down. We know it's going to replace fossil fuel vehicles, assuming people don't just keep their fossil fuel cars and this becomes another car. And so we need to really look at that issue, and hopefully VIC and others can help us in terms of this, the actual effect of these purchases now and in the future. The strategies, we could talk about this for hours, the strategies to get there, and this is what we're going to have to dig into. We're talking purchase incentives for individuals, we're talking purchase incentive for fleets, we're talking about charging at home, public charging, employer charging, all the charging and more on infrastructure, charging infrastructure. Building code improvements are really important for multifamily, interoperability, the ZEV program and how Vermont participates in that. That's the California program. We could be talking about limiting fossil fuel vehicle sales in the future, and that's going on within the context of the ZEV program and more. So that's just a little taste of the strategies, and that's why when Jane said we're going to have them all listed by June 22nd, I was like, there's a whole lot of work to do there. If you look at the document, that the very rough draft document that was sent around along with this PowerPoint, you'll see more detail in these things to the extent that we have it. And then, equity, funding, cost, availability of vehicles suitable for rural lifestyles. These are just a taste of the challenges that we're going to need to think about. But then we also know there's a bunch of really good benefits in terms of cost savings to households and businesses and keeping fuel dollars in state. So let me go to the next slide. So here's this idea of fossil fuel efficiency. And this is making our overall fleet more efficient, aside from EVs. The technology is out there. The federal government is reassuring us that CAFE, we were worried about CAFE a few years ago with the last administration, but CAFE, it looks like we're going to go back to those standards. So that's going to really help. Cars are going to be available. There are programs already in place, like Mileage Smart, Replace Your Ride. Those are two programs that we need to look at and have a lot of potential for low-income families. There are other options out there, such as a fee bait. So we think it's a great way to address the fact that EVs aren't so much in the used car arena right now. So in the interim, before we forget EVs in the used car arena, these higher mileage cars are a good option. Next slide. And then fuels, this one we haven't put a lot of thought into it. It's a light touch. I know in the past the Department of Public Service has dug into this a little more. What are these fuels that are lower carbon fuels? What role are they going to play in our strategy? We've got biodiesel, renewable biodiesel that has been looked at for on-farm use with some success. Are we talking about ethanol? And do we account for the upstream emissions? I know the last iteration of the CEP does look at ethanol as one of the pathways. CNG for mid-duty trucks, some that is being used, their cost. And then the promise of hydrogen has been going on for 20 years. It's still in R&D and it's generally not available, but do we pay reference to it? Okay, next slide. And here we go. This is the harder one, but the important one, and this is increasing our modes so we can get out of single occupancy vehicles. It's as complex as everything that VTrans does outside of maintaining highways. So how do we increase transit, intercity bus, rail, transportation demand management, which is ride sharing, van pooling, microtransit, those kinds of things, walking and biking. It's an investment issue, and it's with the federal government is a major partner in this, along with the state transportation funds. There's a lot of good co-benefits to this. People who can't afford vehicles or for some reason can't drive a vehicle can still get around. Really, really significant issue. And also there are health benefits from walking and biking. Sitting in a car all day is something that's proven to not be healthy for you. And then of course their cost savings. Finally, land use, and I think Joey really hit on this. We've got to grow the state sustainably. That means adhering to the long-held land use goals of concentrated mixed-use development, dense multi-use villages, towns, and cities surrounded by rural countryside, thus discouraging sprawl and car-dependent land use patterns. You've got to do that in order to make walking and transit feasible. And at the same time, you're going to protect farm, forest, and open lands and the environmental services they provide, carbon storage, food security, more. And all the planners on the call are going, yeah, we know that. That's what we've been trying to do, and the environmentalists too. So we got to do it, and we're going to achieve it through supporting the state's numerous planning and other programs that are out there, directing infrastructure dollars for wastewater, transportation, and more to village, town centers, and downtowns. This is part of the solution. Next slide. And then finally, this is our list of things that aren't easily measurable, but are still belong. They're policy and program issues that still need to be on the table. So we need to use these federal dollars to the extent possible, but we also need to seek sustainable funding sources, and TCI is perhaps one of them. Climate change mitigation programs have to be at the highest levels of government through robust interagency actions. It can't be off in some corner of A&R. It can't be off in the public service department. It's got to be at the top, and it needs to be integrated across agencies if we're going to succeed. We've looked at an environmental justice state equity board or other form to ensure equity. I think that's an issue for the larger climate change effort here, but it certainly has a bearing on transportation. And then the state needs to maintain its strong commitment to the California emissions and ZEV programs and actively participate in multi-state initiatives, because we cannot solve the transportation problem on our own. We're part of a much larger transportation system and economic system that we need to work collaboratively on. So that's that. Let's open it up for questions.
Yeah, I'm going to stop sharing.
Next.
I'm going to stop sharing. There you go. So you can see everybody and I can see you. So yeah, I just want to reiterate some of the questions that I put out there earlier that might be helpful to this subgroup in trying to think about where they're going to take this next. So what's missing? What, if anything, do you see as possible challenges, stumbling blocks that need to be addressed, whether that's equity, cost, or implementation problems? What in the underlying assumptions or analysis that you heard there, do you have concerns or questions about? And then what data or analysis would you like to see that sort of substantiating some of these policies and programs? So let's start with first hand raised. Anybody? Rich.
Thanks, very much for that comprehensive tour. We obviously have to know a lot more about a lot of things. I've got a question about the relationship between your slide on CAFE standards and the transition to EVs. In other fields, for example, in buildings, there's a concern that promoting high efficiency gas boilers, for example, for heat, is promoting lock-in to the gas pipeline network instead of using every opportunity to avoid lock-in and go directly to EVs or go directly to low carbon heating sources. Sorry. And it's so thinking about relying on the improved CAFE standards that would sort of trickle down to the used fossil vehicle market struck me as being kind of part of that lock-in thinking. So I'm wondering whether instead there's a way to think more aggressively about making EVs available as soon as possible to that part of the market that we characterize as the used car market.
Well, I would love to do that if I could be more assured that the costs are coming down and the cars are going to be available, particularly the ones that Vermonters say they want, which are trucks and all-wheel drive vehicles.
Right.
We're big on those, and I don't see that changing. And I think the efficiency issue is a bridge. I hate to use that term, but in the next 10 years, maybe we can just talk about EVs, but I don't feel confident enough to say that we are going to have the vehicles and the costs are going to be acceptable to most people.
And
I could be wrong with it. The changes that have occurred in the last year on EVs is mind-boggling to think that, you know, everyone from the president on down and the manufacturers are saying we're going to do this, and there's a truck, and states are setting these aggressive goals. You know, maybe this is, you know, EV only goals, no fossil fuel sales. Maybe it is going to turn quickly, but maybe I'm just too cautious to think that that kind of transformation is going to occur quickly.
So can I say a couple of things in response to that and just in general? I mean, I do think, I mean, we're at a moment in time and we need to do a massive transition. And I think that like programs like Mileage Smart, for example, where we can help Vermonters at a moment of need get into more high efficiency vehicles, moving out of a full internal combustion engine to a more, you know, hybrid vehicle. Those are programs that ultimately that are helpful now and ultimately may be phased out as we move to more electric vehicles, electrification, and other modes of getting where we need to go that do not rely on vehicles or single occupancy vehicles. So it's sort of like, I mean, approaching this is just recognizing the moment of time that we are in. Not everyone's going to move into an EV. Not everyone's going to move downtown overnight. Like, we need to develop programs, and this is why we're saying like this is an iterative process that programs that may ultimately be phased out. For me, we've also talked about, and we've gotten some recommendations, and I think it should be on the table, like beginning to do what Washington has done, California, beginning to phase out or ban internal combustion engines. Like, I mean, that's not the moment, that's not what we're talking about, but we are talking about a phased transition into very different strategies. For me, when we were talking earlier, we're also thinking about, and it's not captured here, like, how do you make this possible from the consumer perspective? And so like, what are the moments of time, to your point, Richard, like the point of purchase, the point of a lease, you know, the point of need, like helping people in those moments of time, designing programs at that moment that serve people when they're in need to help them avoid locking into, you know, a dirty vehicle that they will have for a long time, or a strategy that may not be most cost effective and carbon beneficial. A few other thoughts. It didn't make it onto this list. We do have telecommuting and remote working on our longer list of strategies. So point very well taken. And then lastly, what I just wanted to add that we're thinking about is sort of how other things like, rate design, for example, like to spur more affordable electrification, and other sort of strategies that are, like, frankly, when we're talking about land use, I'm just using these as just examples of kind of overarching things that we may want to be thinking of. And I don't know how they fit into this conversation, which is like things like a state planning office or some other interagency way of coordinating bigger types of, bigger issues than maybe sort of in like tidy buckets or silos. So I just want to put out some of those things that we're thinking about that we haven't yet fully tackled, but are on our minds and in our conversation.
Thanks to both of you for those answers. Let me sort of respond simply by saying, I think being really practical about what Vermonters need and what people will want is really important. So I wasn't suggesting otherwise. And I don't envision flash cutting to EVs in immediately, but getting higher efficiency, high quality vehicles in the hands of folks who may live in rural areas and may have lower incomes, to me seems like a really important policy goal. And to think about driving market change, not just from sort of the top down, not just from the EV, Tesla market down, but rather thinking about how to improve quality transportation choices from the mid-market and used car markets. And if we can somehow combine those strategies, we might be able to move more quickly.
All right, so Chad, do you want to say something more about your link? I see the word Ford trucks in there. So did you want to add something about what we'll find when we follow that link out?
Sure. Yeah, no, I just thought this was an announcement that came out, I don't know, a few weeks ago. And, and I think there's been a lot of discussion around the fact that we can make this energy transition in a way that is not materially impactful, is not overly stingy or austere. And I think that Ford F-150 announcement, the Lightning, is just proof positive of that. Rivian is developing a larger, maybe more luxury type vehicle, but that F-150 Lightning can be bought for as little as $40,000. So these vehicles are going to be cheaper and cleaner, and I think in some cases you won't have to sacrifice size and four-wheel drive ability. As you just suggested, Gina, we love our trucks. We love our four-wheel drive in Vermont. Sometimes it's critical for certain folks who live in certain locations. So I just thought that was just an amazing, and they sold, I think it was over 20,000 pre-orders in the first 12 hours after the announcement was made, something like that.
So Joey, you still have your hand up. Did you want to say?
Yeah, I just wanted to, it was really sort of related to that,
Yeah.
but also to, thank Chad. I saw that in the chat and I wanted to kind of highlight it, but also to underscore when I'm talking about conversations relating to beginning to phase out, internal combustion engines or other places that have actually put a ban on, by 2035 or whatever on internal, that's for new vehicles. We're talking about we're not talking about taking away people's vehicles. We're talking about a transition and those, other states that have done that, the signals coming from California, the West Coast, internationally on some of this stuff are changing the market. And the Ford example, the Ford F-150 is just one example, but I do think that we're beginning to see those market transformations that are gonna enable people who need that, those kinds of vehicles to avail themselves of it, and those will be increasingly affordable. So I just really wanted to clarify that, and also just sort of note, again, just to underscore as we think about how this interfaces with the consumer in their own purchase decisions and what they need for their lives, like how do we make it, you know, possible for people who need vehicles to avail themselves of more affordable, clean, and ultimately electric if that's required.
Peter.
Thanks, Catherine. I appreciate the thought that's gone into this. Obviously, there are some key considerations in here, and thank you, Joey and Gina and others for putting these together. Couple of quick thoughts. I think, you know, one of the things that we've seen of late is that, you know, state policy and state support for electric vehicles drives a lot of the availability questions, to prove that we have skin in the game, are interested in helping to make sure that vehicles are being delivered here. So that's a huge part of things going forward. And then where the interplay between what Joey talked about in terms of the California ZEV mandate and the changes that they've made to that relative to both light duty vehicles and heavy duty vehicles, we will be looking at from a regulatory standpoint in Vermont soon. There are lots of pieces at play here. We are currently part of the regulatory structure that you know, we've selected the California model versus the EPA model for various things, and we don't have the ability to choose our own path. We get to pick one or the other. And so thinking about where that goes and trying to understand where the feds are going under the new administration will be a key factor in terms of that decision-making process. But that's a big picture thing that is often, frankly, overlooked in this discussion, is that the regulatory underpinnings exist currently. We would need to make the decision to update to the new version that got to a internal combustion engine phase out by 2035 in light duty vehicles. But that is a discussion that we will be having, you know, shortly. So.
Peter, what's the timetable of that? Or do you know, you don't know?
There are a number of pieces coming. I don't have specific timetable for you. I can start to dig into that with the team and find out that for everybody. Because obviously that's a huge factor as to what we account for in the policies we're looking at. So I will report back.
Really important. That's really important.
So we have 10 more minutes set aside for this. I'm not seeing any hands, but I'm wondering, Joey and Gina, you had mentioned that if people wanted to dig into more of the details that was in the Word doc, is there any particular aspect of the work that you've already done that you would like to get more feedback on, the places where you've been sort of struggling? I can bring your slides back up if that's helpful, but.
Well, I would say that the consultant and anyone else who can help us plug in the numbers, and Jared's staff has helped us. We were a little nervous about plugging them in too soon, but we need to plug in what the metrics are in terms of registered vehicles, vehicle sales, gallons of fuel sold, commute trips. I mean, there's an array of data, and we need help figuring out what those numbers should be, and then around that, and then setting goals and relating it back to carbon. So if you look at that rambling Word doc that was sent around, it's not complete, not even finished. You'll see a lot of question marks and empty spots around numbers and all other issues like constraints and benefits and the other data points that are on the spreadsheet.
I saw Deirdre's hand shoot up when you were mentioning that. Deirdre, did you want to add anything in terms of specifically the data question?
Actually, no, it was a little bit earlier. Sorry, it took me a minute to figure out how to raise my hand.
Can I ask you to hold it just to see if Peter,
sure.
Peter and Richard, did you have a response to Gina's question or ask? If not, we'll go back to Deirdre.
Go ahead.
Okay. All right, Deirdre, go for it.
Sorry about that. I was just going to add a little bit more to what Peter was saying about the timing for looking at the potential adoption of the California emissions regulations. Regarding the medium and heavy duty standards, that we will be considering probably within the next couple of months. Because if we are going to adopt those, it would make the most sense to do that before the end of this year. And then regarding the light duty California emission standards, their Advanced Clean Cars 2, CARB is still working on kind of finalizing the development of those. So those will be a little later. The timing on that, I'm not exactly sure on.
Thanks, helpful information. I think Peter, you had your hand up next.
Pretty sure Rich had his hand up before.
Okay,
me, so I'll
sorry.
happily defer to my co-chair.
And I wonder if Gina and Joey, you have given thought to how to pay for the initiatives that are on your wonderful list of things, good things to do. You help us out with trying to figure out what the how to capture value from all the savings, fossil fuel savings that would come from these policies, and flip and invest that value into the transitions that you've got on your list.
Well, I'm going to take a stab at answering your question and hold the second part of your question into just a moment and let Gina. So in terms of how to pay for it, just to underscore that I think we really think that the ARPA dollars, like this is 40%-ish, significant chunk of our emissions. There's an opportunity to really maximize federal stimulus dollars potential. So I hope that we as a council will send a nod to that in our greater report, not just for transportation but for recommendations more broadly. But that's a significant opportunity. Whether we join the Transportation and Climate Initiative, there's a conversation, as Chris Campany is just participating in right now, about the 3 other states in Washington, D.C. that are moving forward with this regional cap and invest program for the transportation sector. If Vermont joins, that is approximately about $20 million annually that could be used to invest. That's an annual, those would be the approximate allowance revenues raised from that program that we could potentially invest in programs that really spur the transition and do what I hope, if we do move forward, and I hope it's on the table because I think we'll need revenue. Look at what our neighboring states like Massachusetts are doing. They have a complementary push on that policy to set a higher level of commitment, 70% of the revenues raised to go towards support for lower income, more marginalized BIPOC folks to make those investments. And those investments would be informed by an equity board who helps guide where they go. So TCI is another one we've explored. We really want to explore further this concept of a fee base for new vehicle purchases. So at the moment of purchases of new vehicles, sort of sending a signal to incent more fuel efficient vehicles or electric vehicles. And just to note that a fee base could be a revenue neutral source, but again, it's sort of in the concept of trying to incent the things that we want to people to do more of and disincent the sort of strategies that we want to move people away from in a cost-effective, equitable way. A fee base is something that we're looking into more. Anyway, so to answer your second question about, I don't know the exact answer to okay, since we import every liquid drop of fossil fuels that help us get where we need to go, is there a way potentially to harness some of those savings? I don't know the answer to that. I mean, potentially, I think it's a very good question that we could look into. I know cities like mine, the city of Montpelier, has a revolving loan fund. There may be strategies there that we could look at, either whether that's at a municipal level or at a state level. But I think the point is very important about how do we, really use dollars wisely and shape policies, programs, approaches that sort of capture those benefits, whether that's at the individual level, community, or state level. Gina, do you have other things to add?
Well, I think we need to look at where the money's coming from for the programs we have now, and whether that's sustainable, being the T fund or anything else. We also need to keep in mind that for EVs anyway, not so much for the alternative modes, but for the EV programs, those are going to transition out. So eventually the private, in the ideal scenario, it just becomes the way we buy vehicles, and it's cost effective to go buy an EV and not something else. It's right now what we're trying to do is to jumpstart this market and this transition, whether that's in 10 years or 20 years. I look to the experts to help tell us how long we need to have this public intervention in what ideally is a private sector undertaking. It's not going to go on forever. So that's just something you need to think about. And I think Joey's right. You got to look at sustainability and cap and invest program. The cap and invest program is attractive in that regard. I mean, you can try to make the case that the savings that you're going to receive are going to overcome any real or perceived increase in the cost of fuel. But I can't really answer your question about how you would reflect the savings back to the incentive program. That's kind of hard to do. I mean, I think we need to do a ton more work on how much money we need and then where we're going to get it. But I do feel that it's going to be a lot more than what we're spending right now to get to the numbers the EAN and others are telling us, the 120,000 EVs by 2030. That's a lot more than what we've been doing so far.
One other thing, Peter, and then sorry to interject, but two other things actually, just to say that, I mean, again, like rate design, what's the potential possibility? And I raise rate design in part because I'm very much interested. Electrification is not certainly our singular strategy. We need a very diverse compendium, as I hope you have seen in terms of our initial recommendations. But that's where I just want to say to our friends in the generation and supply space, Liz, Ed, others, like obviously the transportation world intersects with that electrification and generation and supply conversation. So I'm very much looking forward to ground truthing some of our recommendations with your expertise at some point.
So let me turn to Peter. I think that's the last hand up, and so we have enough time here for public comment at the end.
And Catherine, David Hill has a comment too.
Okay.
Just want to say thank you to you guys. Appreciate that. Thanks for facilitating the conversation, Catherine. I would just like to highlight that to Gina's sort of initial framing of we need to know where we want to go before we can, start to do the work. And looking at the data that was presented to us in the LEAP business as usual, we have a long way to go. And the EV transition is going to be hugely beneficial. But I worry about our list deprioritizing those long-term structural changes to society that will need to occur. I say structural between physically, how are we located and how are we organized, and where are our goods and services and how are we accessing them, whether that be cluster development, whether that be telework and telemedicine, all of those things. Those need to be elevated up the chain because transportation is a symptom of the way we are organized and the way we consume things, right? It is not a be all and end all of itself. And if we don't flip that thinking on its head, we won't get there in the long run. So just want to have everybody bear that in mind, that it's not just a transition to EVs. It's going to give us the solution set we need. And if we don't do the hard work to think about what that future state is now, we won't get there, because it's slow, iterative change.
But well said, Peter. I mean, it's really a question of a sustainable future and all the economic issues around that. We have got to keep our nose to the grindstone to the extent the state of Vermont can influence those things. This is not an either or issue. It's a both issue.
So David, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't find my virtual hand, but I used my real.
Sorry, didn't see it.
The other one went. So yeah, thank you. I mean, I think that this is great work. And you know what Taylor already has in that, I didn't listen into Taylor's presentation today on the LEAP model, but I did hear it yesterday. And you know, he's got granularity in different EV vehicle classes and the anticipated share of new sales. And that's based on the Vision 2020 model from Argonne National Lab, I think was my understanding from yesterday. I may be getting that wrong, but I think, Gina, to your question, it will help to match some of the numbers and with what EAN has done on what's in the business as usual at the pace and the share that new sales will start to be EVs, you know, and then that translates into the fleet population on the road. And that can also tie back to Rich's questions on the portion that are older and used vehicles and stuff. I don't know whether there's any data available on the age of vehicles by income class. And that might be something that would be longer term for maybe the Data and Science Subcommittee or something, but there may be something on vehicle registrations or estimations of that could be helpful in the long term. But thank you all for your work on this. It's really a good place to work from.
So is it okay, Peter and Richard, if we turn to the public comment and start with Steve, since we lost him the end of the last time? I see one more hand. Let me go to Annette before we go to public comment, or Annette is a public comment, sorry.
Correct.
I wanted to ask Steve, Steve, you might want to keep your video off and that might help your connectivity issues, but I wanted to give you a chance to finish up what you were saying when you dropped it off.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Apologies for the tech issues. I posted a link in the chat for those who were on at the time that to the document that several of us submitted earlier that addresses pretty much the same issues. One thing that I did not get to, well, two things. I spoke, perhaps you heard or perhaps not, about the missing greenhouse gas emissions that don't show up currently in the inventory. But there are a couple other key things. One is the issue of renewable energy credits and whether that translates at all into carbon accounting. I'm not sure there's a legal pathway for that to translate into carbon accounting, but it certainly makes a difference when you think about the fact that we use renewable energy credits in some cases. Some are perfectly legitimate, but at the same time we're creating greenhouse gas emissions for that same end use of energy, and it seems when that is happening, it just seems like our system is failing. So I'd hope to look at that. And the other thing that I just mentioned briefly is there's a really important question about additionality. You know, the idea of whether what we've been doing in the past is enough, especially, well, in a lot of areas, but one particular area is in looking at our natural system sequestration rates. What we know from the science, and is obvious from the science, is we have to do better than what we've been doing. And if we just do what we've been doing before, that's not doing better. So that's a sort of a rough definition of additionality. What are we going to be doing that we haven't been doing yet? And if we're counting all the sort of business as usual sequestration against all of our emissions, then we're failing to meet the challenge of the planet. So we really have to figure out how we utilize that concept of additionality. What are the additional things that we can do to increase our sequestration and storage of carbon in our forests, and soils and wetlands. So that's all. I'd be happy to follow up with anybody about any of this. Thank you.
And your comments are going back to the business as usual presentation for the most part, and how that's applied, or how we view that. Is that right?
Yes. So based on this, looking at this a lot about this morning's presentation on the LEAP modeling and how that, what variables figure into that, what assumptions figure into that.
Great.
And I think it has. There are decisions that have yet to be made that have a big impact on what pathways you identify and how in different sectors.
Thanks. Glad we got you back. Annette.
Yes, on the transportation side, I think it's at least 15 years I've been at every opportunity promoting the idea of commuter rail on the Western Corridor. I mentioned it maybe 6 or 8 years ago at a VCAN conference, and David Blittersdorf was there, and he said he agreed with me that electric vehicles weren't the answer. He then went out and bought rail cars, but he's been trying to put them on the route between Burlington and Montpelier, which I will note already has an interstate, and the rail line's controlled by a very challenging company, whereas on the Western Corridor, we don't have an interstate. And we have seen some progress in getting Amtrak from Rutland to Burlington, but that's not serving Vermonters. And I think there's a small section of rail between Rutland and maybe Manchester that needs to be upgraded, but I think it was already upgraded from Bennington to Arlington during the Dean administration. It was upgraded for passenger rail. So I would like to, I'm sorry if this is too specific and not abstract enough for your work, but I really think that it's a great economic driver for this region. Imagine a rail car plying the route from Bennington to Burlington all day long. It would be a huge benefit to this entire western side of the state. I now dread having to go to Burlington. It used to be a 2-hour drive. It's now at least a 2.5-hour drive. And I love riding the trains. You can get work done, and it's a beautiful, beautiful route. And I really think that it's something that has real potential. There's all these issues with crossings, and I know that it would have to be done on the ground at a community level. It's not a simple thing to lay out, but I do think that it has real potential and has many benefits for the western side of the state. Thank you. Wait, I suppose I should comment on Ken Jones' comment. As I understand it, these rail cars that David Blittersdorf has, he's working on electrifying. So it doesn't necessarily have to be the passenger rail. I know that one experiment had very high emissions, but that doesn't have to be that way.
Thank you, Annette. And I don't know if Gina and Joey, if you have, an idea of if or when you get to that level of specificity in your recommendations, or when is the climate action plan actually getting down to that level, if at all? Maybe Jane, you have something to say about that, but
this is one of the questions I have in terms of our ability to work directly with the consultants.
Yeah.
I feel like
I just want to say that, when we talk about the extent to which we're going to dig into the alternative modes is unclear to me at this point. VTrans is busily working away at rail plans and transit plans and all these different sort of looks into the future with, I hope, the energy benefits in mind. So I don't think we're going to be redoing that work. We have to rely on that work. But I certainly think we need to be talking about all the different options at a high level. And then the folks that administer the programs and spend the money, they're the ones who need to do the planning to the specificity you're talking about, and that, which is, you know, really important work. But I don't see the Climate Council doing that stuff. You know, the regional planning commissions, VTrans, municipalities, that's where that work needs to happen.
So if I may add a little more, I've pretty much quit commenting on the state rail plans because with this comment, because I've never gotten any traction whatsoever. And so I guess even if you all are not getting down to that level of specificity, if there was a way for your work to create a guidance to encourage that sort of thing, that might create some potential. I mean, I've gone to rail public forums, I've spoken about it in regional planning commission meetings, it just never goes anywhere. So I've just quit, I give up. But I do think that it's a viable option, especially as we're looking at trying to change behaviors and get out of our cars.
Thanks. So we're at the top of the hour and I see people starting to drop off. Probably have to get to the next Zoom meeting, but one to turn it back to Rich and Peter just to talk about what's up next and any other wrap up that you want
to. Just add quickly, just that we will, based on the document there, the work plan that Jane shared, we have a couple of things to go along with the electricity and building sector presentations we'll get on the 24th. We'll start to work on that agenda and make sure people get information as quickly as possible. But appreciate the deep conversation on these incredibly important topics today and the public comment and continued engagement from all. So thank you.
I would say everything that Peter just said and want to thank the task leads for continuing their work. We have to continue to develop these ideas, get them to a state where we can present them to the full council within the next month and a half. So onward and upward, everybody.
Final plug and reminder for the Just Transitions event on the afternoon of the 17th. Thank you all.
Thank you all.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye.